lake that the Klickitats, by the tradition of living members of the band, have told researchers that they abandoned early in the century or late in the last century, I'm not sure which, because of the abundance of Sasquatch.
Please support this channel by subscribing and leaving comments.
It's an important part of what we do, and a good way to reach out to a wider audience on a number of different topics that somehow tell us something more than we already know about the region in which we live. I want to tell you that after the talk tonight, you'll have a further chance, if you want, to talk to our two panelists, because across the hall there'll be a little reception with coffee and cookies and the books that we'll be discussing tonight. Where Bigfoot Walks and Wildlife will be there, and the authors, I'm sure, will be happy to sign copies. I think most of you got evaluation forms on your way in. I hope, if you didn't, that you'll pick one up out at the table on your way out and fill it out. It's the kind of feedback we really need to offer kinds of programs that appeal to people and meet your interests and needs. And there is also out there a sign-up sheet. If you're not already on the CCRH mailing list and would like to be, please do write your name. It's not a petition for an initiative for any ballot. It really is just a mailing list, so feel free to sign it. Tonight, as you know, we have this wonderful topic, imagining Bigfoot, and two speakers. Bob and Molly talked among themselves and decided that we'll first hear from Bob, and then we'll hear from Molly, and then we'll open it up to your questions and discussions, because I know that many of you have interests and concerns and things to say. And both Molly and Bob have, I am quite certain, things to tell you in return. So let me, right now, introduce our first speaker, Robert Michael Pyle. Many of you have, perhaps, this green sheet, which has many of the details of the work that he's done, but let me précis it, at least to some extent. The most important thing, it seems to me, is what we actually say here in the very last sentence, that he is a lifelong conservationist who has done the things and thought the thoughts and been involved in the activities that led him to be the 1997 receive the 1997 Distinguished Service Award from the Society for Conservation Biology. He's brought to all of his writing and to his other concerns the viewpoint of a biologist, of a scientist, it seems to me, a scientist with an exceptionally inquiring mind that takes him in directions that some other scientists perhaps might not have gone. He has been generous in sharing what he knows with the wider public, particularly on his field of deepest specialty, it seems to me, which is butterflies, on which he's written a number of books and taught and been involved in various projects. And he has in print now at least 4 books: Wintergreen, Rambles in a Ravaged Land, The Thunder Tree, Walking the High Ridge, Life as Field Trip. How's that for a great title? Life as Field Trip. And Chasing Monarchs, Migrating with the Butterflies of Passage. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with this mic. It's either one of us is going in and out. I want to think it's the mic and not me. And as a result of all of his writing and all of his activities, Robert Pyle has won a number of important awards. The John Burroughs Medal for Distinguished Nature Writing, a Guggenheim Fellowship, which, as I understand it, was awarded for him to do the work and the writing and the research which led to Where Bigfoot Walks, and a number of other awards, including 3 Washington Governor's Writers Award and a Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award, among others. And I could go on, but I won't, because I want you to hear now from Bob Pyle.
Thank you so much. It started raining, it made me thirsty, so I'm going to begin by pouring some water. I wish you had some as well. Exit right there, you go outside, put your head up and open your mouth. And you too shall be relieved of your thirst. There. Good evening. Rather than repeat all the thanks that Sue so graciously gave, I'll simply say thanks to all the same folks, to the sponsors and to all of our hosts here. And thanks to Sue and thanks to Mary Wheeler for the organization, for getting all this together, bringing us for the Castle's lectures. I especially want to thank Tia for driving me here today through the rain, and to Molly Gloss for sharing the podium with me for these next 3 days. Molly, what can I say? I'm one of Molly's biggest fans. That's what I can say. And it's a deep honor to be presenting on this subject of honor with her. I'd like to dedicate the talk to the animals of our dreams. And if you think it's strange that I should have had a Guggenheim Fellowship to write on this topic, I will simply say that if Bigfoot walked in the door right now and sat on your lap and presented you with a bouquet of lilacs in October and said something very sweet in your ear, that would not be half as weird as getting a Guggenheim Fellowship to write about Bigfoot. So you're not the only one. It was Halloween night of 1970. I was 23 years old, camping near Mount St. Helens. I couldn't sleep, and then the cries began. From the southwest up toward the plains of Abraham, they boiled out of the night like bats from a deep and silent cave, each one an invisible note on the staff of the black sky. At first, the calls resembled shrill barks, but not canine in the least. And then they accelerated in tempo, grew in volume, and rose in pitch until they sounded more like whistles. I'd been studying ornithology and mammalogy with Professor Frank Richardson, a great naturalist, and we had gone over the known vocabularies of Washington's birds and mammals. I'd heard many in the field and had listened to recordings of most of the others. I ran again through the species that might have produced that tortured concert: elk, coyote, red fox, bobcat, puma, the winter owls. The calls I was hearing were not in the repertory of any of these, as far as I know. My back was crawling as well as yowling itself, so I lay still and listened. The sound of the chorus changed again to suggest the crying of babies. The snowmobilers had long since left. There was no one up there. The cries persisted for many minutes, subsided, resumed, and then played on into the pre-dawn. They might have been a dream, they were so strange and unworldly, or rather deeply visceral, but different from anything I knew in the world. Yet this was no dream. Something is definitely afoot in the Pacific Northwest forests. Either an officially undescribed species of hominoid primate dwells there, or an act of self and group deception of astonishing proportions is taking place. In any case, the phenomenon of Bigfoot exists. Whether the animals themselves are becoming scarcer, or whether they even walk as corporeal creatures at all, their reputation and cult are only growing. More and more people, including credible and skeptical citizens and scientists, as well as the gullible, the wishful, and the wacko, believe that giant hairy monsters are present in our midst. What does this mean? Who is this beast described by the great ecologist G. Evelyn Hutchinson as our shadowy, perplexing, and perhaps non-existing cousin? I think of Bigfoot as an emblem of the Pacific Northwest, standing for the residents' earnest and whimsical frontier curiosity, for their eagerness to grasp the essence of the land and its life. It reflects our fascination with the bizarre, the monstrous, and the mysterious. The more like us, the better. As a fuzzy sort of grail, Bigfoot positively shines with the hopes, both noble and pathetic, of the outsider, the searcher, the latter-day Linnaeus, the wannabe Darwin, or maybe Barnum. It mirrors our schizoid approach to the universe, now crying out to be gulled, now hard as bones against belief. Well, I've been looking into Bigfoot, but not looking for Bigfoot. Plenty of others are doing that, and I might add that some very distinguished Bigfoot researchers are in the audience tonight. True believers whose hearts, souls, and wallets are on the line. I'm not one of these. Even so, I felt the need to take my research to the hills, to confront the concept of Sasquatch on its own ground. I wanted to get inside the head of Grendel, to watch the fleeing forest from within. And most of all, I wanted a perspective only the mountains would give. The mountains I chose were Washington's Southern Cascades, a region of intense Bigfoot activity, judging by the density of reports over the years. Specifically, I zeroed in on a range of black peaks running crosswise to the main north-south axis of the Cascade volcanoes. The name Dark Divide applies both to this chain of impressive basalt extrusions and to the roadless area that surrounds it. The divide, which separates the Cispus and Cowlitz River drainages on the north from the Lewis River on the south, lies roughly in the middle of a diamond formed by Mounts Rainier, Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, and Mount Hood. My plan was to trek across the Dark Divide from top to bottom. I would enter the northern end of the roadless zone and hike south on trails and cross-country. After reprovisioning at road access points, I intended to cross and turn the Indian Heaven Wilderness area and the forbidding Big Lava Bed and arrive on the shores of the Columbia River in early October. I gave myself a month for the journey. Early fall made sense because it was after my busy season of field work and teaching, but before the autumn rains and mountain snows. I hoped that the mosquitoes would be finished, the huckleberries at their peak. And so, like another man who courted large subjects a bit beyond his backyard, I went deliberately into the woods. 20 years after the night of the wild cries, my wife Tia and I pulled into Tower Rock Campground in Gifford Pinchot National Forest, and I went from there. Now may I have the lights off? Thank you. Is that sharply focused? How could you tell? Touch screen focused. Oh, good. Okay. So I went into the Dark Divide, and this is where you start. This is the largest unprotected wilderness area in Washington State. It will someday, if many of us have our way, be a wilderness area. And I think we number I'm thinking of our local state senator now. We number a lot of local politicians among those who wish to protect the Dark Divide into perpetuity. But at this time I went up to Juniper Ridge carrying, as you might say, rather more than seemed strictly necessary, much of which was water, because I suspected strongly that I would not be encountering very many water sources in the Dark Divide in the autumn time. And I was so right that I had to alter my plans ultimately for lack of water and near dehydration. But long before that happened, I headed up the rather steep and yet beguiling trails into the Dark Divide wild area, which, when they are not completely rutted by motorcycles, are very wild. And I pitched my tent on a ridge that felt as if I was strung in a web between the Cascade volcanoes, among the Cascade volcanoes, with Rainier to the north, Adams to the east, Hood to the south, and Mount St. Helens on my west. I'm trying to decide if this, is that clear? This is a strange machine. Okay. So I watched the sun come up over Mount Adams, and I watched the moon come up over Mount Adams a little bit later, having made a few miles progress down the ridge. And I watched the sun go down by Mount St. Helens. And it's when the sun goes down deep in the wilderness that the mind begins to experience its full amplitude of imagination. And it's then when one could look up into this black, ragged ridge called the Dark Divide and imagine that it might be called that for any number of reasons. The Dark Divide? What a pregnant name is that. It means the divide between belief and non-belief. Maybe the divide between humans and non-humans. Dark, what's that all about? The Dark Divide. Actually, it turns out that it was just named after a guy named John Dark. And it's a watershed divide between the Sispus and the Lewis. Nonetheless, you can read any number of resonances into that name, and I certainly did, especially after the sun went down, and you could look up there, and you know, I forgot to ask if there were a pointer here, but that's okay. You can use your imagination just as I did. Somewhere up in those ragged ridges. Oh, there it is. Right up there. Can you see an individual object standing there? I'm telling you, it looked like the big galoot. Nope, that's not what I meant to do. Go back. Go back. Oh, no. Anyway, I've never touched screen to slideshow before. Okay, let's see if we can get it a little sharper. Maybe it's blurry. Do you see what I'm talking about? Do you see Bigfoot in that picture? Come on, don't do that. I know. There. Anyway, you can see what I'm talking about. Right up there in that little rock cusp was a pillar that stood there, and it was broad-shouldered. I got my binoculars on it and said, gosh, could it be? Could I be watched? But in the morning, it was still there. And the sun came up, and everything was bright again. Now, this is the Dark Divide. This is the wild country I was traveling across. As I said, not in search of Bigfoot as such, but in search of everything that I was thinking about Bigfoot. I had immersed myself in Bigfoot culture and Bigfoot lore and Bigfoot literature for a couple of years by this time, and I wanted to spend time in the territory that is rich in Bigfoot lore, primarily from the Klickitat peoples, and just see what I thought when I came out. I went in with an open mind, partly because of my experiences on Mount St. Helens in 1970 that I read you about. But, you know, I wasn't asking the question of existence. I wanted to know, what does this great Northwest archetype, if you must, this great myth in the sense of a belief, not in the sense of a mistake, what is this body of tradition that permeates all of the Northwest Native American cultures? What is it today? Has it been reduced to a mere tabloid joke? Bigfoot baby found in watermelon has Elvis's sneer, is the name of a chapter in my book. If this writing thing doesn't work out, I can write for the tabloids perhaps. Or does it still carry any of the power and the potential and the consequence for our culture that it has carried for so many before? As I carried on farther into the Dark Divide and crossed from Sunrise Peak and Jumbo Peak down to Quartz Creek, I came to some of the great remaining Douglas fir old growth in that part of the Cascades. And as you see, when I say came to, I mean came to, because leading up to it is a great clear cut of the sort that we're familiar with. And so when you come to an edge of the forest like that, you know it. And when you look into the edge of a forest like that, all bounds of possibility fall away. And you can imagine that anything could be in there. You can look at one Douglas fir, dark Douglas fir that's crossed by one bough of vine maple, and imagine what might be behind that Doug fir. Again, fertile territory for the imagination, but not just the imagination. Fertile territory for possibility, which should, in my view, be the underlying rationale not only for literature, but also for science. Vladimir Nabokov, the great novelist, said, "Does there not exist a high ridge where the mountainside of scientific knowledge meets the opposite slope of artistic imagination?" And if that can't be found in the Dark Divide and in the territory of Sasquatch, Sedlatix, Sayatko, Oma, Tsonakwa, Bukwis, Bakbakwali Nexiwe, then I don't know where it can be found. I passed through the Indian Bury Grounds, as they're known, where there's a handshake treaty from the 1930s that says that whites can gather berries on one side of the road and only Indians on the other side, and was hoping that I might come to an area that hadn't been quite so picked over after that. But it was a good omen for one of the questions I was asking, which was, supposing such an animal were here, would there be anything for it to eat in the autumn in the Northwest Mountains? I came then to the Indian Heaven Wilderness area, which I hiked a good deal of. You drop onto this area and you see these beautiful lakes, and you can't even imagine what's going to be there, but as you pass farther and farther into this plateau, you come to the most stunning scenes you've ever seen. Broad meadows with lakes coming through them, and these rather weird, or am I just bringing that to it, these rather weird pinnacles of fir forests. And it's easy to bring words like that with you, even if you're a naturalist, and I'm a biologist who knew much of what I encountered. But the Klickitat legends that inform the Indian Heaven are so rich and thick that I think you ignore them, possibly at your peril, certainly at the peril of your understanding of the place. Especially a place like Lemhi Crater. Now, this is a place where the author of the book on the Indian Heaven, whose name escapes me at the moment, who had gathered a number of Klickitat tales of the Indian Heaven, felt a deep magnetism for. He finally walked up the side of this crater and down into the bottom. And he said he had never felt more solitude, more sense of imminent mystery anywhere he'd ever been. And that's the one place where he felt that he might have had a possible encounter with the animal itself or its presence. There was no question where I was going to camp in the Indian Heaven Wilderness area. X marked the spot. And where I camped was on the shores of Cultus Lake, a very beautiful lake. Members of the band have told researchers that they abandoned early in the century or late in the last century, I'm not sure which, because of the abundance of Sasquatch, I believe it is, with Klickitats. In other words, the numerous encounters there with Bigfoot. Not that these encounters were violent. Often with the Indians we hear of encounters that involve jokes, particularly rude jokes, and sometimes exchanges, and sometimes abductions, but always uneasy feelings. So naturally, that's where I wanted to camp. It's a particularly lovely lake, and it seems as peaceful as could possibly be, and it was in the autumn. By day, it's a little harder to explore the bounds of what's possible because we're so enwrapped in the physical and that which we already know about the world. However, the next lake over presented me with a gift that truly jolted me in the middle of this trek. This is Deep Lake. And of course, I had to filter all my water, and Deep Lake had a number of flat surfaces, rock surfaces, lithified volcanic ash. Not lava, but lithified ash along the shores. And you could sit there and filter your water and fish. I tried fishing a little bit, caught a cascade spotted frog by the foot with my first cast and gave up. But I found that in my favorite place to sit and filter water, there was a particularly unusual impression in the lithified ash. And it was foot-like. Sort of runs off on the right-hand side there. But this is not very far from Goose Lake, where there's a famous, anthropologically accepted set of handprints in lithified ash that's usually underwater now with a small dam at the head of Goose Lake. And so it's not impossible that this might have actually been an impression. Nonetheless, it was kind of exciting to find, and I did take a cast of it. It's one of two casts that you might want to come down and examine up front. Robert Pyle, the great Bigfoot researcher, when he took a look at it, he said he suspected it probably didn't have anything to do with the foot, but the important thing was that I had seen it. And that's exactly right for all natural history. When we go forth into the world, the important thing is to keep our eyes open. I have no idea what might have made an impression such as that, if not a foot, but you can leave that to your imagination. Obviously, it doesn't prove anything. But I kept my eyes open. Well, then, of course, the night falls again, and you make your fire big. The moon's out, but you're by yourself. 100 hours of solitude I experienced in the Indian Heaven Wilderness area, which is rare in our experience. Didn't see another human being for that time. And of course, I was reading Peter Burns' Bigfoot book by the fire for about the 18th time and getting myself all psyched up, of course. And the coyotes were getting louder and louder and closer to camp. Of course, I listened to coyotes every night at home, but nonetheless, these were Cultus Lake coyotes. And all of a sudden, through the brush comes bumbling a great anthropoid figure. It's true, it was a lawyer from Portland. This was Friday evening, and at that time, people pour into the near wilderness areas. So I'd seen his party come by a little bit earlier and go off, and I directed them to the lake they were looking for. It was already dark when they came, and I offered them to share my campsite, but no, they carried on. And Papa came along a little bit later. Solid dark, and almost fell in my campfire. Raised my blood pressure for a few minutes there. It was autumn. The mosquitoes were gone, and the huckleberries were out, and it enabled me to explore one of the questions that I brought with me as a biologist, which was, you know, we're not asking the question of actual existence here, but what are the major obstacles to the possibility of a large anthropoid ape in the United States? Well, there's no biogeographical problem. That means the history of distribution of plants and animals. There are anthropoid apes in North America, one species that we know of. And there are prehensile-tailed New World monkeys in South America. So there has been crossing of the Bering Strait by primates at least once, probably more than once. No evolutionary problem with the possible existence of Bigfoot. If, as Grover Krantz believed, a Bigfoot does represent a living species of Gigantopithecus, because Gigantopithecus does occur in the fossil record, which chimpanzees and gorillas, by the way, do not. So if the fossil record were your basis of belief, you would believe in giant apes, but not chimps and gorillas. Well, what about metabolically? Could there be such an animal feeding off the landscape? And then you realize that the three keystone predators are missing from this ecosystem. Grizzly bears, wolves, and in most of the areas, pumas and black bears also. Actually, the two main keystones are missing. A lot of food goes composted up there every year, folks, and I ate a lot of it. I ate largely wild foods on the whole trek, not entirely, but largely, such as king boletes and lots and lots and lots of blueberries. And I found out why there was blue poop everywhere I went. Blue bird poop, blue bear poop, and I won't go on. I don't think metabolism is an objection to the animal. Not at the season that I was there anyway. And I've commonly had guests for breakfast as well, by the way. Little gray jays. Now, you're looking at a little bit of my equipment there, and I didn't have a whole lot of stuff with me I didn't think I needed, but take a look at my equipage exploded, in the exploded view. No, sorry. That's the gathered view. That's the gathered view of everything I was carrying on my back, this beast of burden. And it was only about 75 pounds. I know a lot of search and rescue people carry more and so on, but for me it was a stretch. I hadn't backpacked with that much weight for some time. But here's the exploded view. Look at all that shit. But I felt I needed it all. And here's the point that I came to realize. If we're talking about a couple of species of apes in the Cascades, which is the better beast? Which is the one, whether it's in our minds or not, that survives in the utter absence of anything but its own wits and its own ecological adeptitude? Finally, I came to the big lava bed, the wildest place in the Cascades in many, many ways, an area that's almost impossible to cross. And I didn't cross it. I managed to penetrate it in a few places and go around the edges, but if there's one place I can imagine a wild beast that we don't know about hanging out, the big lava bed is one of those places. And it left me with the feeling when I reached the Columbia River in Carson Hot Springs, which was part of my motivation for going all the way. It left me thinking that the land is wilder than I ever even imagined. Now then, I had to go back. I had to be back at a meeting of the Natural Heritage's Advisory Council for Natural Areas in Olympia the next day. I'd been a month without any obligations. But I just couldn't face the freeway yet. I realized I could get to Olympia just as well by crossing the Dark Divide on dirt roads as by following the Columbia to I-5, if I didn't mind losing a night's sleep. After having the forest roads largely to myself for so long, this seemed infinitely preferable to sharing a rainy freeway with semis and motorhomes. I wanted to buffer my emergence from the mountains until the last possible moment. And so leaving Carson at last, I turned left instead of right and headed north. By the way, it's almost Halloween, so this is wrapping up soon here. This is my scary Halloween story for you. By 9 p.m., I had shot up along the western fringes of the big lava bed in Indian Heaven. Near one of the trailheads, I stopped to cut some noble fir boughs for a silk screen that Tia had in mind. And then I carried on up the small forest road. The rain diminished as I rolled northward along the eastern verge of the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. And at 10, I crossed Elk Pass, where Boundary Trail number 1 intersects the road. I pulled into the trail parking lot to get out and stretch. This was becoming a long night. To wake up, I walked away in the black rain and the fog, and realizing where I was, I crossed the Dark Divide for the last of many times in this trek. hailing it with a Pyramid Pale Ale. Now later it would become important to note that this was the only beer I drank that night. Striding back toward the car, I heard an eerie whistle. In the fog, it chilled my spine just a degree or two. I stopped. It stopped. I resumed, and it resumed. And then I realized that the sound was the whistle of the wind in the neck of my ale bottle. I recalled the sound of air escaping my car seat up on Bluff Creek in California that briefly distracted me, and how that had momentarily caught my attention. And again I laughed at myself and I shook my head. Ha! I snorted, dummy. But back at the trailhead, as I make notes in the comfortable glow of the overhead lamp, I hear another sound, definitely from outside. Whew! It shrills, descending the north hillside ahead of me. Sharp, loud. It's no bird I know, no owl I've heard. What bird would it be in the cold fog and the rain and the dark? And it is real, a real sharp whistle, repeated at intervals. It pauses, and I drive back onto the road. Coasting down the road past a creek, I stop and hear the whistle again. The sound is quite close to my left on the hillside, loud, piercing, and not always shrill. It has a hoarse or grating or metallic undertone, not so different from what I heard by the shore of Cultus Lake late at night. The rain has become a mere drizzle. The night is entirely black, the full moon masked by sopping clouds. All is silent, and then the whistles begin again. They are fairly rhythmic, as bird calls are, and sometimes have a nasal, reedy, birdy quality, but the sounds vary and move across the hillside. I whistle back. Whew! The whistler answers, now shriller, more urgent. It seems almost enraged, or at least irritated, as the cultist caller did. I am tingling. I've often talked with owls, sometimes, indeed, even by blowing across the mouth of a beer bottle, but this is different. The whistles seem to come from no more than 100 feet away. The maker moves back toward the creek, a little behind me, over my left shoulder, and then it fails to respond to my whistle. I've turned off the engine to hear better and not intimidate whatever it is. My lights are doused as well, except for the brake lights. I listen through my open window carefully, quietly. I'm about to pull over, get out, and shine my flashlight up into the brush of the hillside, and then, with the suddenness of a gunshot, bam! Something strikes the roof of my car like a slap. Involuntarily, I yell, punch the clutch, key, and throttle at the same instant, and if an old Honda can be said to burn rubber on a wet dirt mountain road, it does. I don't stop until my heart slows down a quarter mile later. Shaken, I get out. There's nothing on top of the car, no dent or mark, and I feel foolish for having panicked. But it was not my decision. Like the autonomous nervous system, like smooth muscles, the action occurred on its own. I didn't pee my pants, but I got the hell out. I went back to the site where the car was flat. There was nothing to be seen on the road and no more calls to be heard. I kicked myself again for not remaining to have a look. Something had been up there in the dark divide. Well, I couldn't leave the puzzle alone. 5 days later, after I'd left the hills, Tia and I headed back up the Lewis River, bound for Elk Pass on a bright, colorful autumn afternoon. We arrived at the boundary trail as the day began to cool. The place of the sounds was a low, wooded slope beside the 2-lane paved highway. And there were, I again confirmed, no trees overhead to drop cones or debris on the car top. Between the pass and the site I had fled, a small, rough track diverges westerly into an old quarry or borrow pit. And above its rim, bracken and fir were outlined against a rapidly moving cloud in a cold, blue October sky. The odd dump truck and RV passed on the road, and then it was quiet until a fighter blasted overhead at a few hundred feet. Lots of rain had fallen since that night. Everlastings nodded with the burden of it. The pumice looked like grainy March snow against the earth. I had climbed a slope to a small shoulder that ran from the road up to a higher ridge and formed one side of the quarry. Immediately, I saw a line of large impressions ascending the slope on the other side. Careful not to disturb the marks, I worked my way down the loose bank to a spot where I could see them clearly. My mouth dropped. These were tracks, big tracks. And there they are. They'd been rained on. They were in loose pumice. They weren't the crisp Bigfoot tracks of the sort that you see photographs of and prints of, such as this beauty that's reputed to have come from Bluff Creek in California, the site of the famous Patterson-Gimlin film. But they dwarfed my big Frankenstein boots. And the crispest of them all, the most clearly measurable with the best heel cup and the best big toe sort of thing, the two of them had exactly the same measurements. 15 and 7/8 inches in length, 5 3/4 across the instep, and 3.5 across the heel, right in the mean and median of the Bigfoot Research Project's database. Now, this was a shock. Tia said it's pretty darn hokey how it happened right at the end of your time in the Dark Divide. I said, I can't help it. Like Dave Barry, I am not making this up. What shocked me more was 9 years later. My book, by the way, Where Bigfoot Walks, was translated into Japanese. The Japanese did an absolutely gorgeous design job, so you must come up and have a look at it. I doubt if we'll be able to read it, although if anyone can, you can tell me if the translation is good. And a Japanese film producer had read it and called and wanted to come over and make a film for his long-running Tokyo Animal Planet sort of program, and did, brought his crew, and I took them up into the Dark Divide, and they said, can we find tracks now? And I said, well, you know, Larry, can we find tracks now? That's right, I sent them to you guys, and you sent them up with the cast, which made them happy. And I said, I doubt it very, very much, but I'll show you where I found these impressions 9 years ago. And then he said, well, can we go to the heart of the Dark Divide? I said, the heart of the Dark Divide is about 20 miles that way, but we can walk 300 yards, and you'll see territory wilder than you ever have. And we did. Deep, old-growth, noble fir. And then on the way back, to make the story short, with me in the lead, random route, melting snow, bit of exposed pumice. No one had been there before us. There was another impression. I found it. No one went before me. The Japanese film crew absolutely flipped out. Of course, they were very happy. And I was shaken. I made my plaster a little bit loose, and it was kind of cold. It didn't set up very well, but it gives you the general impression. The Bigfoot, the big toe wasn't that big, but it was pretty crisp. And what was especially nice was the space between the big toe and the ball of the foot. You can't see it here, but it was very crisp. Pretty good heel cup, and the other toes were merely suggested. And the funny thing was that that was the month that Where Bigfoot Walks was chosen for the Oregonian Book Club. And so Jeff Baker called from the Oregonian and said, can we go up to the Dark Divide next week and take a look? And I said, Jeff, have I got something to show you? Which we did. And I didn't draw much attention to this. It was just a single track, a single impression of some sort. But here's what got me. 9 years later, 300 yards from where the initial impressions had been made, and exactly the same measurements. And I considered it a great gift. May I have the lights back on, please? The gift was that of an open mind. When I went into studying the Bigfoot phenomenon, I very much thought that it would be a lovely thing to come out with an open mind, but I rather doubted that I would. I thought, if I spend a couple of years immersed in this topic, I'm almost certain to disabuse myself of the desire to believe, of the possibility of belief. I am a biologist after all. Well, I hadn't come to that point. I didn't know what I thought. And then I had these experiences at Elk Pass, and the second experience 9 years later. And the great gift of it was that I came out with an open mind as well. In her book, Stepping Westward, Sally Tisdale says she feels sorry for the true disbelievers in Sasquatch, who have lost their own mammalian vigilance for the greater earth. I agree, because most of all, Bigfoot shows what could have been and what could still be, if only we treated the land as if it were really there. For the very wildness from which the Bigfoot myth emanates is disappearing fast. The struggle for the leavings, the roadless zones, the old growth is vigorous and current. If we manage to hang on to a sizable hunk of Bigfoot habitat, we will at least have a fragment of the greatest green treasure the temperate world has ever known. If we do not, Bigfoot, real or imagined, will vanish. And with its shadow will flee the others who dwell in that world. Looking at that tangled land, one can just about accept that Sasquatch could coexist with towns and loggers and hunters and hikers, all in proportion. But when the topography is finally tamed outright, no one will anymore imagine that giants are abroad on the land. I'm continually asked by those who hear I am writing about Bigfoot, so tell me, do you believe? Well, I've never answered yes or no, and I don't intend to now. Not because I'm afraid to take a stand, but because I don't know. Bigfoot as beast, or Bigfoot as Rod Serling saw it, an apparition walking in the landscape of our minds, that's up to others. I'm content to have walked where Bigfoot walks for a season or two. Oh, Sasquatch walks all right, whether as a hank of hair and a hunk of bone, or a boon companion in our hearts, is something we may never know, and it might not entirely matter. When E.O. Wilson met Kanzi, he was unnerved by how much the encounter with an educated bonobo felt like meeting a 2-year-old human child. I had to ask myself, he wrote in Biophilia, was this really an animal? Perhaps it's time for us to see, as Darwin saw, that the point of separation between man and not man has no fixed place and is, as he said, a matter of very little importance. It's time for us to say, as Thoreau said, we are conscious of an animal in us. Maybe now, more than ever, the dark divide between the monsters in our minds and the monsters in our midst is the shadow land we walk together, hand in hand with Bigfoot. Thank you very much. Thank you.
If you're enjoying all this rare and unique content, please show your support by subscribing and leaving comments.